Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're at. I'm Frank Satterwhite here with Dave and Nancy. Really excited to talk to you about digital transformation, but how security is key. And it's the linchpin to not only realize the benefits of this digital transformation, but to see it continue. So before we get into the great conversation, I want to tell you a little bit about me. I'm Frank Satterwhite. I'm cybersecurity principal at 1600 Cyber, a pan-European cyber consultancy. I'm American. I went to UC Berkeley, proud Berkeley grad. And the reason that I'm so interested in participating in conversations like this is taking the real world experience I get protecting networks and systems and companies every day and fighting against cyber attacks. And then just conveying that to people so they get a real sense of what we're facing and how we have to work together to address this opportunistic landscape, but also a very vulnerable one. So without further ado, I'll have Dave introduce himself, please.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for hosting us. I'm Dave. I'm the CEO of OneLayer, enterprise-grade security for private cellular networks. We built the product and company because we saw a huge gap that probably we'll discuss here today.
And Dave, I have to tell people, what people don't know, he's from Israel. Israel is a hub for cybersecurity, very smart people in Israel, but also very passionate. It's a very passionate cyber community there. I have a lot of colleagues there. And he's currently in America doing the CEO tour, so glad to have you here. And Nancy, hello again.
Hey there, Frank.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and please.
Yeah, happy to. So excited today to speak with industry experts like yourself and Dave. So a little bit about me. I'm the general manager and head of engineering and product for AWS Data Protection Solutions. So what we do is we're a team of builders and we build, we call them services, but to the outside world, they're products that help customers secure, protect, and in times of need, recover their application data. So this is certainly one of the hottest emerging use cases that we see among customers. So excited for the conversation today.
Great. And so let's talk a little bit about what's happening today. So 5G is a critical component of this digital transformation, but there are a couple of key things people need to understand. Imagine right now that there's still 3 billion people in the world that are not connected to networks. Imagine that the number of devices being deployed every day is exploding. So me as a cyber person and Nancy and Dave, both professionals, I just think more attack surface. And I cringe and I'm up at night. And so today, when you think of 5G, tell us a little bit about how IoT connectivity and 5G are playing a role in the current state of IT today, Nancy.
Yeah, so if you think about cloud providers in this space, right? From AWS, you see 5G, wavelength, local zones, for example, that provide customers with the flexibility of cloud, even as they're on, the very edge, right, of their internet presence. And so when we think about, sort of securing customers' data as they're being processed or generated at the edge, we know IoT devices, they're subject to a lot of attacks, right? And especially if we are serious about evangelizing 5G and fast connectivity and all the goodness that really comes from being super connected, we also need to think about what is our protection strategy around setting safety perimeters, around setting guardrails of how data is being processed, accessed, and secured at the edge.
And Nancy said something really key. Data is being processed at the edge. You hear about 5G and it's so fast and it's super reliable, but back to the part about it being fast, data is no longer physically traveling as far. It's being processed on the edge, as Nancy said. And the perimeter, securing the perimeter controls we need to put in place and securing this data and how we manage this data on the edge, it presents a new set of problems and new opportunities, but it's definitely new problems. So. And then just people hear 5G, they think it's one thing. They think there's some people don't understand there's a public 5G network and there's a private 5G network. For me as a security professional, the main difference when I think about them is one, for private 5G, you have complete control. A lot of the same hardware infrastructure, but an organization has complete control, which can lend itself to better security. I also, when I think about private 5G, there may be very specific use cases, right? Say a person, we all like music festivals, an organization wants to have a music festival in Sweden, in the country, and they want to have a virtual augmented reality experience for the customer. Well, this is a perfect scenario for something that's like private 5G because they have complete control of that network and can deliver that high quality experience. Nancy and Dave, can you think of anything else about public versus private, just so people are clear?
Yeah, so I think that you have a platform, a protocol that is provide you great capabilities as a private 5G or the public 5G. When you are looking about the private 5G, it's just another enterprise network that you now own. And that's required you and provide you the capability as any other network that is part of your ownership, both in terms of responsibility and value you can gain. When you're looking about public 5G, that's a different use case. That's a different type of need, mainly consumers' perspective.
Exactly. And Nancy, as we deliver this experience or this consumer's perspective and experience better sometimes from a private 5G network, is there anything else, any other primary consideration people should keep in mind about private 5G?
Yeah, so to me, all right, coming from, sort of the hat of data protection, a lot of the sort of end consumers that I typically deal with are, Fortune 500, very regulated customers. And what comes to mind most often when they think about 5G and connectivity is that security needs to be at the forefront of all of their policies, right, and everything that they do. So one aspect that I often discuss with my customers is that of asset visibility, because without that, right, you need to know what it is that you're actually even protecting to even start to come up with a strategy, right? So with that said, the problem with onboarding sort of 5G, at scale is really the magnitude of those devices, and to what Dave just mentioned, right? Everything that you need to keep in mind with regards to public-private networks. And I mean, it's crazy to think that, for example, some customers, when kind of mentioning, right, sort of basic hygiene around, using SSL, right, or basic encryption, right, that can be sort of the foundation of their security strategy. So it really starts from the foundational building blocks.
Right. Excellent. And then something else, like at least in my career, previously before this digital transformation started, things like 5G private networks became more and more prevalent. When you had cellular security and IoT security, and then you had enterprise security, they were almost completely in separate buckets. I remember we managed incidents off the cellular mobile networks for places like O2 or Verizon. We'd manage those completely different in terms of how we'd manage an enterprise type cyber incident or attack. So we see these converging, right? Now you have these devices from your mobile phones and other IoT devices. They're all integrated and they're all leveraging the benefits of 5G. Of course, this creates problems, more attack surfaces. So is this an opportunity to improve because now we can see holistically our enterprise and everything connecting to it? Or is this create more concern and things we need to raise an alarm bell on? Dave, what do you think?
So I think that the topic that we are trying to crystallize in terms of security is the IoT needs. Cellular security built for years to protect cellular carriers. And this cellular carriers perspective is to protect the core function. At the enterprise perspective, we're speaking about protecting the IoT devices. And we can split the IoT devices to two parts. sophisticated devices that can be protected on the edge, on the device itself. That's work from home approach. And in that term, the networking is less dramatic if it's a Wi-Fi or cellular. But in most of the critical networks, the IoT devices are less sophisticated. In that term, you need to provide network security to protect the devices. And as Nancy said, the basics is to provide the visibility and the context-based segmentation. Now, as Nancy said, we are all speaking about that cellular, especially 5G, is the most advanced protocol. And of course, it have the best hygiene ingredients like SIM authentication, like encryption built in. But we are not protecting IoT devices with a cellular protocol. We are protecting IoT devices with security tools.
Right.
And that's in my perspective, the main gap that we are seeing in the private cellular domain. Because for years, cellular products built for IP, Ethernet networks, and now you have the same needs of security, but the architecture is different.
Right. It's harder to identify the devices, but this shift in the architecture. And if
Exactly.
you can't identify the devices, that affects your ability to authenticate and then understand within which context they need to connect, obviously. Right.
Exactly. So if you're looking about the zero trust approach, the authenticate is only the first layer. Then you need to authorize, you need to understand the context of the device. You need to understand its destination and behavior. You need to keep his visibility when he's swapping between private to public, between private cellular to Wi-Fi. You need to keep your ability to manage and secure the device.
And so 100% agree on that. And so Nancy, when you look at some of the things Dave just described, and when you're having meetings with different organizations, large organizations that are looking to utilize and leverage 5G, private 5G networks, do you kind of include in the conversation, hey, listen, because things are changing, your security needs to change, and then recommending how they make those changes? Or how is that playing out in the real world?
Yeah, so I think, Dave did a really good job going through the various edge cases, right? And oftentimes I hear similar questions from, customers I talk to, which is, hey, what if I have a new camera that's just joined the network that's not on the approved vendor list, right? Should I quarantine that device? Or for example, hey, one of my employees, right, work from home, that's the biggest use case I hear as well, right? They have a device that's consuming bandwidth outside their allowed range. Like, what should I do with that? And that, I think, goes back to what I started the conversation with, which is the first step to having a holistic, security approach, whether that's data security or device security in this case, right, is really around asset visibility. Because with this proliferation of many devices now joining the network, right, you essentially have can you guys hear me?
We hear you fine. I hear you, Nancy.
Okay, awesome. So it looks like my internet just went out. So so without, repeating everything I said, right, I think the main takeaway from everything is around asset visibility, right? Because with the proliferation of many more devices joining your network, right, and using all of these different 5G bands, what used to work before, such as Artemis, right, no longer works. And you need to have a more platform-wide approach around device security for 5G.
Right. And you both brought up some interesting points. I want to shift a little bit, because when we wanted to identify the devices on the network, like we just said, the ways to identify them has become more complicated. Specific scenario, think about OT environments. What they want to do with private 5G networks and IIoT and IoT devices, they want to create scenarios where, say Ford, for example, they've got robotic welders. They implement a private 5G network. They want these robotic welders to be able to constantly communicate, and they want the devices managing this production or these workflows or the orchestration involved to be constantly connected, uninterrupted. And so what you have is a scenario where if I'm a hacker, or I hate that word, cyber criminal, and I'm able to just get in the vicinity of one of these devices, I could assume that connection and literally interrupt an entire orchestration process that could bring down a factory or a plant so I guess what I'm trying to get at is in the scenario where we have to identify devices, back to zero trust, I really think that I won't say it's mandatory, but there has to be something that meets that requirement, delivers that capability, right? So tell me a little bit, Dave, about OT and the challenges that are related to that and how we have to manage these multitude of devices that are not just connecting, but they're staying connected.
So first of all, I think that you crystallize in a powerful way the change. In a public network, if I gain access to one device, the value will stay local. So again, of course, no one likes that his credit card or private info, data is being leaked, but it's a lot of effort for one device. Now with the private cellular networks, access to one device can destroy the production, can stop the production at all. And that's a shift in terms of cost value mechanism for the attacker to pinpoint to this specific attack vector. And as you mentioned, enterprise built for years security solution to protect OT environment. And this security solution, the methodology of enterprise security in OT environment for IoT devices are very structured. The challenge is how we implement the same methodology that we all use today, the OT environment, to the same enterprise new OT that communicate with the OT environment. And the challenge is that there are forming differences that we are seeing between the two types of security solutions. First, the architecture is different. So the devices communicate with the cellular core in much more centric approach. Secondly, the identifiers of the device is different. If we are securing IoT device, we are trying to filter the data, looking for patterns, anomalies, find the insight. When we have that insight, we want to correlate it to the device identifier, to the device source. But the challenge is that IP networks work with IP and MAC address. Cellular networks work with cellular identifiers. So you have a challenge to keep track of the device if you communicate between the networks, if you communicate from the cellular network.
And something just to add to that, the identifiers for the device. So for cellular, it's IMSI identifiers, right? Everybody knows how, I won't say it's easy, but it's definitely not a very difficult problem to assume that identifier. And then once you assume that identifier, the network will recognize you in the context of that device. So the thing about zero trust, like you said, it requires context. So if someone assumes that identifier within this OT and IoT environment, like I described with Ford, zero trust would make those devices that we're connecting still have to connect within a certain context, and with additional attributes that would verify and clarify their right to have that connection. Nancy, when it comes to zero trust and just the idea of, you've mentioned a couple of times, you talked about visibility. What are some ideas how we maybe can look at that in terms of not just having visibility, but also ensuring that once because visibility might be an identifier that's been compromised, right? So what are some creative, can you think of anything creative that we can do to handle this problem? I think Nancy's internet is.
Well, it comes back to understanding, right? What's in you.
We hear you now, Nancy. Go ahead.
Well, it comes back. Can you?
I should. Dave, can you hear her? I think she's breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, I think we have some challenges in the connection of, like, she need a private 5G in her network. So
No, I've done many conversations with her, and we.
Can you hear me now?
We hear you
Off.
fine. Yes.
Okay, awesome. Let me know because I can also switch to my iPad. Yeah, so to finish off, I think that having a policy engine that not only understands, right, what is in your environment, and I go through this quite often with, the CIOs that I talk to from my customer organizations, is what do you want to do with your data? Like, how do you want to secure it? Which actors can do what to what data, and what actions are you going to allow and deny? Right. And so that becomes a foundation of your security, playbook. And I see this playing out in, for example, the conversations that I have around ransomware. So as part of the, task force within AWS that has been tasked to come up with, hey, what are, protection mechanisms or strategies that customers can employ for their cloud workloads? We talk about this a lot, right? Which is having that intelligence to understand, hey, this, given this attack, how should we respond, right? And then employing that into a defense in depth approach, which includes, for example, constant monitoring, right? To understand what are all the evolving attacks within your environment, right? Understanding how to set up a zero trust, perimeter, for example, around your most mission critical workloads. But then also understanding what workloads are most critical to the functioning of your business, right? Where are your maybe dev secrets, or where are your crown jewels, and making sure that not just in 5G sort of space is secured, but even more so at the 5G level because of this proliferation that we're seeing around people working from home, bring their own devices onto the network.
Right. You just said something. You said this proliferation, but it's not just 5G. It's just the environment in general. There's a proliferation of attacks. Want to add something to that. So every device that's deployed in these environments, not every, but most, have vulnerabilities that are well documented, that are well publicized. And so you have to still have a defense, like a layered approach, like Nancy said, for your security, because the vulnerabilities span across the entire environment, right? So, and then when you have like a private 5G network, well, the vulnerability is in the airwaves if I'm close enough to whatever it is I want to compromise. So a layered approach, zero trust is great, but also just a layered approach to securing your environment. Dave, you're shaking your head. Do you have something to add to that?
yeah, I just want to say that I totally agree with Nancy, and I think that she pinpoints a specific gap in security for the private server networks, because if you want to be able to provide policies to prevent, to reduce the attack surface, at the IP networks, besides the layer 7 application like LDAP authorization, you have firewalls and network access control. And the gap that we are seeing, I think that the source, the crystal of the foundation of OneLayer were to provide that capability, because firewalls here inside the cellular networks have a big gap because the traffic is separated between the signaling and the data to two different channels.
And Dave, that causes what? Latency.
Exactly.
Which defeats the whole purpose. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted to make sure people understood that. Go ahead.
Exactly. So real-time correlation is challenging here. And there is totally absence of network access control, like we all familiar with, something that is less intrusive at the IP networks also here. And I'm with you. I think that the policy enforcement, since this network is device type agnostic, it serves both IT networks, OT networks, and other capabilities, has a mandatory need to be able to authorize the networks based on the segmentation, based on the context we mentioned.
Something I hope that people get out of this, I always try to make sure people get something out of the conversation to take with them, is that if you're going to realize the benefits of 5G and and we're talking about putting policies in place. When you have a private 5G network, then you have full control. You can implement policies. You can implement layers of security, specifically with the policies though, to realize the benefit of private 5G networks. Usually people want to align to a use case, right? So kind of an idea that I think makes sense is when you're implementing these use cases, sometimes there is a security there's a security segment within the use cases. Sometimes there's not a very good one. But to you both, how do we, to realize the benefit securely, how can use cases play a big role, whether it's manufacturing, energy, automotive? How would you encourage people to put them on equal footing when they're moving forward with 5G, private 5G network? Dave?
So I think that for a security player, it doesn't matter if the camera or the critical machine communicate with the Wi-Fi, cellular, or cable network. You want to have the same visibility, the same segmentation, the same policy enforcement. And in order to do that, you need to track the device, even if it's swapping between the options. So you could have the same security perspective. And you need to, they already have the desired standard of security. Each enterprise is a manufacturing. And the private 5G is only providing more capabilities to do so. And you need to keep the gap in the security perspective to provide the same approach you built for years, to have the same visibility and the same policy enforcement just here.
Really quick, so your risk appetite, your approach to security, none of that changes when you start using private 5G, is what you're saying.
I'm saying that the devices are the same, just with a different way of connectivity. So the vulnerabilities and the need for example, software updates, the ability to segmentate, the ability to track the devices, to monitor, and any anomaly detection here. All the same needs you already build and prioritize in your IP networks. Let's have the same approach here. Just find the right tools to do so.
Right. And Nancy, realizing benefits, and something people can take out of this conversation. Data. You have exponentially 10 times more data connectivity capacity with 5G, more devices that are generating more data, storage requirements. I would not want to be you in this day and age, but how do you look at that when you think about all these devices generating more data, and what are some things people can do if they're going to use private 5G and have more connectivity? What are some key things they can do to realize benefits securely with respect to the data aspect of it?
Yeah, so we see data the same, right, across all platforms. And that's the sort of centralized approach that my team takes, because, our charter is securing customers' data regardless, right, and everywhere that they are produced, whether that's, in the cloud, on their premises, in hybrid environments, or on, 5G devices, right? So for us, just understanding for example, if you're on your private, 5G network and you're dealing with credit card information or dealing with personally, identifiable information, making sure that data gets the same level of security, privacy treatment, right, as data that is generated in public cloud regions. So for example, is that being retained for the retention period that you need, right, for example, healthcare data, right? Or for example, is that data being encrypted? Who has access to the data? Making sure that your, for example, identity policies, right, give the principal the least privilege or only what they need, right, to access certain information. So all the same, I would say, standards or controls that we assess data, right, within public cloud regions, we also need to do the same to devices that are running in private 5G.
Right. And that was really great. I think the last question for today, and then we'll take questions if there are any, is when we talk about private 5G networks, a lot of times there is some integration for no other reason to have a fallback capability or failover capability. in the event your network becomes unavailable from a cyber attack, or not, it could be anything. So when we're talking about integrating these networks, when you think public 5G, network slicing, there are things you can do. And then private 5G, you have complete control, but there's always the technical touch points that create risk. So Dave, what are some ideas maybe in terms of how you need to look at this through a security lens if you are a leader and you have areas of your infrastructure where there's your private 5G network as well as interconnectivity with the public 5G or public network?
So I think that the use cases of swapping devices between private to public cellular or between private cellular to other connectivity to the enterprise networks, in all the cases, the source of the solution you need to be able to track the device. You need to be able to identify the device wherever it's connected to. And once you have that, you can build all the security solutions on top of that. If it's authorized approval or is that's quality of service. In each way, when you have the device identifier, you can allocate the specific rules, detect and response, and other patterns you're looking for.
Nice. And Nancy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I'll perhaps provide a contrarian viewpoint. Right. So in this day and age where networks are one of the major attack vectors or surfaces, is customers are also considering disconnected. And so that is actually another area that my team and I work with, which is being able to secure data in air-gapped, for example, data vaults, or disconnected edge devices that can operate on the network, but can also operate off the network. And oftentimes for customers, for example, there's a regulation for financial bodies in Mexico that require every piece of data that is stored in a public cloud to also be stored in a disconnected device. And so we're seeing more of these business continuity controls that are coming out from regulatory bodies that are really shaping how we think about, okay, is my data secure, right? No longer is it, okay, it's started across 3-4 different regions, it's highly durable, available, but rather these, I would say, protection mechanisms considering the entire network topology as well.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I really hope that what Dave and Nancy just said people can take with them, because that's a common use case, and hopefully that'll give you some ideas of how to approach that scenario. Having said that, it's time goes so quick. I do think we are done with what we wanted to share with you. If there are questions, Manon, do we have time, or have we talked too much?
Just one question, because we have to wrap up in 2 minutes.
Sure. So I see a question in the chat. Are there authentication protocols or regimens that can be advertised or represented by IoT end systems to help secure their connection to enterprise operator infrastructure? So Dave or Nancy, any thoughts on that?
So if I understand the question, of course, there is the IMSI authentication process, and they ask, okay, but we have IoT behind it. Maybe someone swaps the SIM. We want to be able to track that. So this is part, I think, of the zero trust approach of detecting the patterns, two-factor authentication, like any other enterprise network. So it's true that you have the SIM identifier, but you want to make sure the device behind it is the same device you thought it should be. And that is a context-based perspective. So in one sentence, if I may, enterprises already have their approach and just need to ask, what is my internal methodology to secure IoT device, and how can I implement the same methodology? What tools do I need to have the same capabilities just for that new enterprise network on cellular protocol?
And Nancy, anything to add to that? We have another question, man, if you want me to ask it, or are we out? So I'll paraphrase Nancy. iPhones, many security patches, some of these updates are making the iPhone incompatible with certain 5G networks. How security of mobile devices and the explosion of 5G networks going to coexist.
Gotcha. And I think that, devices running on just a multitude of different protocols also represent a big challenge, right, to central, IT security teams, and just with standing with their hats on, right? That's why, for example, automatically pushing down updates, right, or quarantining devices, which are more commonly seen these days, right? Putting devices in isolation if they're not up to the latest security patch, right, or running the latest, operating system, for example.
Right.
And so those are best practices that can come from central IT teams, given that people are, to this question's point, bringing so many different devices to the 5G network and therefore corporate networks.
Okay, we are out of time. Nancy, as always, awesome talking with you. Dave, enjoy America. And everyone, we really enjoyed the conversation today. We're all on LinkedIn, so if you have questions, be sure and hit us up. Mana, thanks for having us.
Thank you very much, Frank.